My mother always preferred my older brother, but when he left her with nothing, she begged me to help her. Ever since I can remember, my mother always had a favorite, and it wasn't me. My older brother, Javier, was the sun who shone in her eyes. I could try my hardest, bring home trophies from school, get the best grades, but it always seemed like everything I did vanished as soon as Javier entered the room. He was the perfect son, the one who could do everything wrong and still get a free pass. If something broke at home, it was because I had provoked him. If he got into trouble at school, I was the one who had to help him get out of it. No matter how fair or unfair it was, it always ended up being my responsibility or my fault. I remember one of my birthdays when I was 10 years old. I asked for a chocolate cake, and we ended up with a vanilla one because Javier didn't like chocolate, and we all had to be considerate. That was our dynamic, and at some point, I simply stopped trying to compete. I got used to being the invisible son, the one who served to fill in the blanks between my mother's expectations and Javier's whims. And although it wasn't fair, it was what I had been dealt. But something in me changed when I grew up and realized that I didn't need to keep playing that game. At 18, I left home, worked, studied, and built a life that didn't depend on the crumbs of attention from my mother. I became a man, something I'm very proud of. For years, we only spoke on the most basic level: Christmas calls, the occasional family gathering. Of course, she kept talking about Javier as if he were the best person in the world. I just listened, nodded, and let her continue living in her bubble. But a week ago, something changed. I received a call from my mother. And although I usually limited myself to keeping my answers short and polite, this time her tone was different. She was crying, desperate. The woman who always saw me as a second thought was now begging me to help her. At first, I thought she might be exaggerating, as she often did, but no. It turns out that Javier, her golden son, had done something I never thought anyone would be capable of doing to her. He left her with nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean it. He sold the family home, emptied her accounts, and disappeared as if he had never existed. My mother, who always treated me as a last resort, now called me as if I were her only lifeline. She asked for help with a desperation I had not heard before. And although deep down I felt a small satisfaction at the irony of the situation, I was also invaded by a wave of doubt. Should I really help her after all she made me feel over the years? After how she always put Javier above me? Or maybe this was my chance to set things right, to show her who was really strong when things got tough. The truth is, I don't know if I'm ready to forgive her. But something tells me that this disaster is far from over. I'm going to give her a couple of days to explain everything to me. But this is just the beginning, and something tells me that although this started as her problem, it could end up being my victory. Update 1. When I hung up that initial call with my mother, I sat on the couch for what must have been at least 20 minutes. I had so many conflicting emotions that I didn't know where to begin processing them. How could someone like her, who had always defended Javier to the point of blinding her own eyes, now call me to beg for help? It was spinning in my head. Was her desperation genuine? Or was she just resorting to the only resource she had left, someone she had ignored for years? During those days, I tried to focus on my routine, but I couldn't get what I had heard out of my mind. Out of curiosity, and perhaps a bit of morbid fascination, I decided to do some investigating on my own. I went on Javier's social media, and there he was, as carefree as ever. Recent photos showed him enjoying some tropical location, cocktails by the beach, extravagant dinners, and a new woman in his life, a young model with whom he posed as if they were a couple straight out of a magazine. There was no trace of regret, no worry, nothing to indicate that he had just stripped our mother of everything she had. I finally decided to call my mother back to hear the whole story. I needed to know exactly what had happened before making any decisions. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. What I heard that afternoon was a disaster that not even I, with all the years of favoritism I had witnessed, would have imagined. My mother, blindly trusting Javier, had signed a broad power of attorney that allowed him to manage all of her accounts and properties. According to her, Javier had told her that it was only temporary, a quick fix, so he could unlock a loan he needed for a business. The business, a unique investment opportunity, was now nowhere to be found. Shortly after signing the documents, my mother began to notice strange things. Her bank called to confirm unusual transactions, but Javier assured her that everything was under control. When she realized that the house was for sale, he already had a buyer. And when she tried to talk to him about it, Javier disappeared completely. He didn't answer her calls, didn't respond to her messages, nothing. He had gone from being her favorite son to someone who had abandoned her without looking back. As I listened to all of this, I realized something important. My mother still wasn't taking responsibility for her part. Her narrative revolved entirely around how Javier had betrayed her, but she didn't seem to realize that she had given him all that power voluntarily. When I tried to point this out carefully, her reaction was explosive. "It's not my fault that I trusted him. He's my son, for God's sake," she yelled with a mixture of anger and despair. I had to bite my tongue to avoid telling her the obvious, that she had ignored all the signs for years, that she had fed that monster by indulging and justifying every mistake he made. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to have that conversation, not at that moment. Instead, I told her I needed time to think. I couldn't just jump in to rescue her without a plan. To my surprise, she didn't try to pressure me. Her tone changed completely, almost as if she had reached her limit of resistance. Before hanging up, she threw me one last comment that remained etched in my mind. "I know I failed you, but you're the only thing I have left now. Please don't leave me alone." I don't know if it was manipulation or genuine regret, but those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mother was in a desperate situation, but I still couldn't decide whether to help her or just let her face the consequences of her decisions. After all, it wasn't my responsibility to clean up the mess she had created. The next day, I spent reflecting and organizing my thoughts. If I decided to get involved, I would have to do it on my terms, not hers. I decided that I couldn't simply ignore her, but I also couldn't jump in without first protecting myself from possible future problems. The relationship we had was too complicated to resolve this in a simple act of help. This was going to be a long road, full of obstacles, both for her and for me. My first step was to call a lawyer friend, someone I trusted completely. I explained the situation and asked him to review the documents my mother had signed because I needed to know if there were any legal loopholes to recover what was lost. I also asked him for advice on how to handle the issue with Javier. My friend assured me that we could investigate, but warned me that if Javier had done things cleverly enough, it wouldn't be easy. That night, as I prepared for what would be a complicated emotional journey, I realized that something in me had changed. I was no longer the child seeking his mother's approval. Now, I was someone who had the opportunity to take control of the situation. If I was going to do something for her, it wouldn't be out of obligation, but because I decided to. Update 2. 2 weeks have passed since I made the decision to get involved, and each day that passes, I realize that this problem is much bigger than I initially imagined. After that initial call, my mother sent me all the documents she could recover. They were poorly kept copies, some stained with coffee, but enough to give me an idea of what she had signed. I sat down with my lawyer friend, Daniel, to analyze everything, and what we discovered left me speechless. First, my mother had granted Javier almost absolute power over her assets. Basically, she gave him permission to manage her bank accounts, sell her properties, and make financial decisions on her behalf. The main problem is that everything seemed to be in order. There were no obvious signs of coercion, and the documents were notarized. In Daniel's words, it's a complicated case because technically she agreed to all of this voluntarily. The second thing we discovered was even more worrisome. Javier hadn't just sold my mother's house. He had also emptied several bank accounts that he had access to thanks to that power of attorney. My mother, trusting him, hadn't monitored her own finances. When she finally realized what was happening, there was nothing she could do. The money was gone, and Javier was unreachable. While Daniel explained the legal situation to me, something became clear. It wasn't going to be easy to recover what was lost. There were some points we could explore, such as errors in the contracts or the possibility of proving that Javier acted in bad faith, but it all depended on gathering enough evidence. That meant investigating, and not only about the documents, but also about Javier. In parallel, I had to deal with my mother, who was falling into a state of inaction that I had never seen before. She stayed in a cheap hotel during those days, and each time we spoke, her tone was more somber. I decided to visit her to talk face to face because I knew that this would require more than just phone calls. When I arrived at the hotel, I was surprised to see her so vulnerable. The woman who had always projected an image of strength, who never hesitated to criticize me or compare me to Javier, now seemed broken. Her face was tired, her clothes disheveled, and there was a sadness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. But even in that state, her pride was still present. At first, she tried to justify everything she had done, saying that Javier had always been so persuasive and that she just wanted to help him. I sat in front of her and told her firmly, "Mom, if you really want my help, you have to accept that this isn't just Javier's fault. You allowed it. You gave him the power to do this. If you don't recognize that, I can't do anything for you." For a moment, I thought she would get defensive, but instead, she burst into tears. It was a different cry from the one I had heard before, deeper, as if she finally realized the weight of her decisions. She asked for forgiveness, not only for what had happened now, but also for how she had treated me for so many years. It was the first time I heard her admit that she had been unfair to me. Although her words didn't erase the damage of the past, something in me softened. I wasn't going to forget everything immediately, but her acknowledgement was a step in the right direction. I proposed a plan. I would help her, but only under certain conditions. She had to be willing to do her part, to work to rebuild her life instead of depending entirely on me. I told her I would find her a temporary place to live, but that she should look for work while I took care of the legal aspect. At first, she seemed hesitant. I think she had never had to face the idea of actually working because she had always depended on others, first my father, then Javier. But finally, she accepted. And although her enthusiasm wasn't the greatest, I felt that at least she was willing to try. During that week, I got her a small apartment that I rented in my name to avoid legal problems. It was a modest place, nothing compared to the house she had lived in all her life, but it was safe and clean. I also got her a list of basic jobs in the area, and although she complained at first, she finally attended an interview at a local store. Meanwhile, my investigation into Javier continued. I decided to hire a private investigator to help me track his recent movements. I knew he was somewhere in the Caribbean, but I wanted more details. His accounts, his connections, anything I could use to pressure him. I couldn't let him get away with this. Not after what he had done to my mother. One afternoon, the investigator called me with an interesting first clue. Javier was living in a luxury property that wasn't in his name. That meant he was hiding assets, probably to prevent anyone from tracing him. We also discovered that his new girlfriend wasn't as innocent as she seemed. Apparently, she had a history of minor fraud, which suggested that Javier and she might not be so different after all. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things were starting to move forward. My mother, albeit slowly, was taking steps to get ahead, and I was building the case against Javier. But I knew this was just the beginning. Recovering what was lost was going to be a long battle, and I was prepared to fight it, not for my mother necessarily, but because I knew that in the end, the victory would also be mine. Update 3. Although things have progressed, I can't help but feel like I'm playing a game of chess against someone who has always believed he can win without even moving the pieces correctly. Javier, the untouchable, is finally starting to show cracks in his armor. And although the process has been slow, each step we take brings me closer to what I consider justice. During these months, my mother has had to face a reality she never imagined. At first, living in a small apartment and working in a local store was almost humiliating for her. She didn't say it openly, but her looks and size said it all. However, something interesting started to happen over time. She became more independent. I was even surprised one day when, upon visiting her, I found the place clean and modestly decorated with things she had bought with her own salary. For the first time in her life, she was living with resources she had earned herself. And although she didn't say it, I think she was starting to feel a certain pride in it. On the legal front, things were moving more slowly than I would have liked, but at least they were moving forward. Daniel, my lawyer friend, managed to identify a couple of irregularities in the documents that Javier had used to sell my mother's house. Although the power of attorney she granted him was broad, there were certain notification requirements that Javier completely ignored. That, combined with the fact that he had emptied her accounts in a suspiciously short period of time, gave us an angle to build a case of bad faith. However, what really gave us momentum was the information from the private investigator. We discovered that the luxury property where Javier was living was registered in the name of a shell company that he himself had created. It was a typical move of someone trying to hide assets. But what really surprised me was discovering that Javier wasn't handling all of this alone. His new girlfriend, the model, seemed to be much more involved than we thought. She had access to the accounts, helped manage the transactions, and in some cases was even listed as co-owner of certain assets. I decided it was time to act. With Daniel's help, we filed a civil lawsuit against Javier for fraud and bad faith, arguing that he had abused my mother's trust to enrich himself at her expense. We knew this would be a long fight, but our main intention was not just to win in court, but also to put pressure on him. We wanted him to know that he wasn't going to get away with it so easily. Javier, as expected, reacted predictably. At first, he ignored the lawsuit. He didn't respond to legal notifications or make any attempt to contact us. But when we started investigating further and pressing on other fronts, he began to show signs of concern. Suddenly, his social media became more discreet. The photos of luxury and parties disappeared. And although he continued to post, it was evident that he was trying to keep a lower profile. Meanwhile, I decided it was time to contact Javier's girlfriend directly. It was a risky decision, but I knew she could be the key to crumbling his facade. I sent her an email through her professional profile, posing as someone interested in discussing an important matter related to Javier. To my surprise, she responded quickly. We agreed to talk by video call, and during our initial conversation, it became clear that she wasn't fully aware of everything Javier had done, or at least she pretended very well not to know. What was evident is that there were tensions between them. Javier, according to her, had been less generous lately, and she seemed to be looking for a way to protect herself in case the relationship ended. I took advantage of that gap. I explained that I was building a case against Javier, and that any information she could provide would be helpful. In return, I promised that her name would be kept out of the case as long as she cooperated. It was a risky move, but it paid off. Over the following weeks, she provided me with copies of emails, bank statements, and other documents that confirmed that Javier had been moving large sums of money to offshore accounts. She also gave me details about some of his businesses, which, as we suspected, were nothing more than scams disguised as legitimate investments. With this new information, our case took a more solid direction. We were not only facing Javier in civil court, but we had also started preparing a criminal complaint. Daniel explained that although bringing someone like Javier to prison wasn't easy, the evidence we had gathered was strong enough to at least initiate a formal investigation. On the other hand, my relationship with my mother remained complicated. Although she had made progress in her life, she still had moments where she seemed to cling to the nostalgia of what she once had. There were days when she talked about Javier as if he were still the perfect son she had raised, as if all this were just a misunderstanding. But little by little, those occasions became less frequent. She even said to me one day, "I don't know how I could have been so blind. I thought I was doing it for love, but now I see it was selfishness. I wanted him to need me, and I ended up losing everything." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Although they didn't justify everything that had happened, they at least showed that my mother was beginning to understand the extent of her mistakes. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and satisfaction at seeing how the person I had always considered strong and dominant was now learning to be humble. The board is set, and the pieces are moving. Javier still thinks he can get out of this, but he has no idea what's coming. I have the evidence, the support, and the determination to finish what I started. It's not just about justice for my mother. It's about showing Javier, and perhaps also myself, that the game has changed. Update 4. I can finally see the pieces starting to fall into place. Javier, the eternal perfect son, is beginning to feel the pressure. And although there is still a long way to go, each step we take brings him closer to his downfall. During this time, things have changed significantly, both for my mother and for me. She, who at first seemed incapable of adapting to her new life, has now begun to build a routine that keeps her busy and surprisingly calmer. She still works at the local store, but she was recently offered a small promotion, which she accepted with a mixture of pride and humility. When she told me, I couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction, not because I wanted to see her suffer, but because she was finally learning to fend for herself. Despite my mother's progress, I can't say that our relationship has completely healed. There are days when we get along well, sharing deeper and more sincere conversations. But there are also times when resentment seeps into the air like a constant reminder of the years of favoritism and contempt that marked my childhood. Although we have found a kind of balance, I know there is still a long way to go before our wounds completely close. As for Javier, the last few months have been a whirlwind of discoveries and legal maneuvers. Thanks to the information that his girlfriend, or perhaps I should say ex-girlfriend, provided me, we managed to build a much stronger case against him. The documents we obtained revealed a series of shady financial moves involving not only my mother's properties and accounts, but also several other people whom Javier had swindled with false promises of investment. The biggest blow came when we managed to track down a hidden bank account that Javier had used to deposit part of the stolen money. It was a crucial discovery, not only because it demonstrated his bad faith, but because it gave us a tool to pressure him. With Daniel's help, we petitioned the court for an order to freeze that account while the case was being resolved. It was a risky move, but it worked. Javier, accustomed to having unlimited access to money, suddenly found himself with one of his main sources of funding cut off. But it wasn't just on the financial front where we made progress. I decided to take a more direct route to expose Javier publicly. I contacted some of the people who had fallen for his scams, offering them legal support in exchange for their testimonies. Many were too ashamed to speak, but some agreed, and their stories were devastating. Men and women who had lost their life savings, convinced by Javier's charisma that they were making the best investment of their lives. With these stories, and with the permission of those involved, I began to carefully leak information to the local press. I knew that Javier valued his image above all else, and exposing him publicly was a way to hit him where it hurt most. The first articles appeared a few weeks ago, and although they didn't mention all the details, they painted a clear enough picture that anyone who knew Javier began to question him. His reaction was predictable. He tried to contact my mother, probably thinking he could still manipulate her. But to my surprise, she not only ignored his calls, but also told me about it immediately. It was a moment that made me feel that, for the first time, she was beginning to see Javier for who he really was. He also hired a lawyer, probably one he thought could intimidate us with aggressive legal tactics. However, Daniel, with his usual calm, was not intimidated and continued to accumulate evidence to strengthen our case. Despite all these advances, the battle is far from over. Javier is still fighting, trying to save what's left of his image and his resources. But every time he takes a step, we've already taken two. His ex-girlfriend also continues to cooperate with us, although she now does so more out of resentment than anything else. According to her, Javier practically left her on the street when the legal problems began to come to light, and now she is more than willing to help destroy him. For my part, I have become something I never thought I would be, my mother's anchor. Despite everything, I have made sure she has a roof over her head, food on her table, and the support she needs to keep going, not because I feel I owe it to her, but because it's the right thing to do. But I don't let this become a relationship of dependency. Every decision I make is calculated to ensure that the toxic dynamic of the past is not repeated. At this point, it's not just about justice for my mother. It's about ending a cycle of manipulation and favoritism that has damaged our family for decades. Javier always thought he could get away with it, but now more than ever, I am determined to show him that his time of privilege and lack of consequences has come to an end. Next month will be crucial. We have a key hearing where it will be decided whether the evidence we presented is sufficient to proceed with the criminal complaint. If we win, we will not only be one step closer to recovering what was lost, but we could also face him with much more serious consequences. I can't deny that part of me enjoys watching his world crumble. But I also know that this victory will not be mine alone. It will be for everyone who has ever been ignored, scorned, or betrayed by someone like Javier. Final update. I never imagined I would reach this point. Everything I've lived through, Everything I've discovered has taken me to a place that not even in my worst nightmares would I have anticipated. If you thought you had seen everything, prepare yourselves, because what I'm about to tell you is something that not even I can fully process. To give context, the last year was a whirlwind. After the key hearing I mentioned in the previous update, things moved quickly. The evidence we had gathered was so overwhelming that the judge had no choice but to allow our criminal complaint to proceed. This was a direct blow to Javier, who until then still believed he could get away with it. The formal investigation began, and with it came more discoveries that ended up changing everything. The first big revelation was that Javier hadn't just scammed my mother and a handful of investors. He had created a much wider network involving shell companies, offshore accounts, and a history of fraud dating back more than a decade. What seemed to be simply a case of breach of trust became a financial scandal of major proportions. Of course, this attracted the attention of the authorities, who began to take more drastic measures. The breaking point came when Javier, feeling the noose tightening around his neck, tried to negotiate. He contacted us through his lawyer with a settlement proposal. He was willing to return a portion of the money if we dropped the criminal charges. Daniel and I discussed it, but in the end we decided to reject it. It wasn't just about the money. It was about justice and making sure he couldn't do this to anyone else. During this time, my mother continued working to rebuild her life. She had achieved some stability, although our relationship remained complicated. There were times when she seemed truly remorseful, but others when her nostalgia for Javier would resurface, as if she still wanted to believe that all this was a misunderstanding. However, something in her began to change when the second big bomb exploded. While reviewing more documents and evidence, Daniel found something that perplexed us. A series of bank transfers from over 20 years ago involving my mother and an account that we now know belonged to Javier. At first we thought it could be a mistake, but as we delved deeper, we discovered something much darker. My mother had not only allowed favoritism towards Javier, she had been actively complicit in some of his early financial moves. This revelation changed everything. The transfers indicated that even before Javier began his major frauds, my mother had been helping him move money suspiciously. This included funds from my father's inheritance, money that she had assured us she had used to support both of us after his death. But the reality was that much of those funds had gone directly to Javier, even before he was old enough to manage bank accounts. When I confronted my mother with this information, her reaction was devastating. At first, she denied it vehemently, but when I showed her the evidence, she broke down. She confessed that she had done it because Javier always had potential and because she wanted him to have an advantage in life. According to her, I had always been stronger, more independent, and didn't need as much as he did. Her justification was like a stab in the back. Not only had she ignored me all my life, but she had also plundered my father's legacy to feed my brother's ego and whims. This confession destroyed any empathy I might have felt for her. Although I had been willing to help her rebuild her life, I now realized that much of her downfall was the result of decisions she had made long before Javier became a con man. Her complicity in his early frauds had laid the foundation for everything that came after. The most shocking thing of all came weeks later, when during a court hearing, Javier, in a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence, confessed something I never expected to hear. He said that my mother had not only supported him financially, but had also helped him plan some of his early scams. Although she stopped actively participating when things began to escalate, her influence in the beginning of his career was crucial. This revelation was the final blow. My mother, the woman who always defended Javier and who for years made me feel like I wasn't enough, turned out to be a key player in this whole disaster. Javier ended up being sentenced to several years in prison for fraud, money laundering, and other charges. But for me, the real betrayal didn't come from him, but from her. After all this, I made a decision that still hurts, but that I know was necessary. I cut off all contact with my mother. I left her the apartment for a while, but made it clear that there would be no more support from me. She tried to apologize to justify her actions, but it was too late. The wounds were too deep, and I couldn't continue carrying the weight of her decisions. Today, I look back and realize that this story was never just about Javier. It was about a family broken by favoritism, manipulation, and selfish decisions. Although I managed to recover part of the lost money and ensure that Javier faced the consequences of his actions, the emotional cost was enormous. I don't know if I will ever be able to forgive my mother, and I definitely don't think I can ever trust her again. But what I do know is that I learned an invaluable lesson. No matter how hard you try to prove your worth to someone who is not willing to see it, because in the end, true worth comes from recognizing your own strength and fighting for what is right.